The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, I'm glad to be here. I hope you're glad to be here too. And of course, my faithful co-host, Lang Baker, is here. Hello, Lang.
Hi, Wayne.
Thank you. We're going to talk about dementia tonight, different types of, or what the different types are, symptoms, etc. and etc. And as usual, we learned a lot of neat stuff, but I want to let everybody know that we are a live call-in show. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927. Call in and share your thoughts, questions, challenges, or whatever, if you have them. We'd love to hear from you. 343-9927. Okay, Lang, so first off, is there a definition of dementia?
Well, this is how it's described by a website for the National Institutes of Health. Dementia is the name of a group of symptoms caused by disorders that affect the brain. It is not a specific disease, and there are many different diseases that can cause dementia.
Okay, so diseases do cause it. It's not like the dementia is the disease.
Right. Dementia is a term that just refers to some of a set of symptoms that indicate the brain's not functioning properly over an extended period of time.
Okay, and they've determined that Alzheimer's is a form of dementia.
That's a label applied to dementia that's associated with a certain set of symptoms and with certain formations in the brain of plaque of...
Yeah, amyloid plaques, I guess, an accumulation of an abnormal protein.
Right.
That's what they call that here. And then Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, they say here, right?
Right. Around 50 to 70% of dementia cases are classified as Alzheimer's disease.
Yes, you know, I found a site, well, actually it was the Alzheimer's Association that has a list of myths that people believe about Alzheimer's, and one of them is that only older people get it. And they say, no, that's not true. It could have onset in the 20s and 30s even.
There is one form of Alzheimer's that's associated with a specific gene that it has early on. It's referred to as early onset Alzheimer's, which I suppose it's still called Alzheimer's because of how it presents, but it's in some respects is distinct because it's associated with that specific gene.
Okay, so the symptoms of Alzheimer's dementia, or I guess what they're wondering if the cause is the buildup of these amyloid plaques, but they're not sure if the buildup of the proteins, the plaques, is the cause or an effect, right?
Yeah, there's some I'm not sure if it's controversy or confusion or lack of certainty about the cause-effect part in there. There's a book that came out just last year called The End of Alzheimer's by Dr. Dale E. Bredesen, who is a professor at UCLA.
The end of
Alzheimer's. Yes, and he's proposing a description of how the disease progresses and what causes it that is more detailed. The amyloid plaques fit into his description, but it's not a simple cause or effect. It's part of the dynamic that it's the death of neurons in the loss of their ability to communicate with other neurons that marks the progression of Alzheimer's, and part of that process involves the buildup of these plaques. And in his research, he discovered or published an article about this discovery back, I'm not sure when, about a receptor on the neurons for keeping the neurons alive and promoting their healthy performance and growth. And this receptor depending on what attaches to that receptor, it either moves in a beneficial direction or in a harmful direction.
And this
the
happens.
APO, which is the amyloid plaque buildup, comes from that receptor going in the bad direction. And then he's identified something like 36 factors that affect which way this receptor responds in the health of the individual. So he's saying that there's no single bullet medication that's going to come along and fix Alzheimer's because it's not a single cause.
No, it's like 36
It's this
different
dynamic that is influenced by 36 different factors.
Okay, so and what you're saying is he's come up with a treatment to influence which way the neuron is snipped.
Well, I don't know if you call it a treatment so much as a protocol on how you can enhance the
good snipping.
Yeah.
Okay.
Through lifestyle habits and through nutrition and through toxins. He divides Alzheimer's into 3 different categories. And he says essentially it's like 3 different diseases depending on whether it's from inflammation, and you can eliminate however many of these 36 factors are active on the inflammation part of the controlling which way the nerve cells go in this dynamic with the APO.
Okay, and this protocol, these therapies or whatever he's talking about, that's what leads. He says that he's having positive results or has had.
Yeah, he's had positive results with his patients. Some of them have reversed the symptoms that they were experiencing that were diagnosed as Alzheimer's. I mean, from what I've read, you don't really get to diagnose until you do a biopsy on the brain after death to see that there actually are these plaques present. But the best diagnosis they can do for Alzheimer's is based on questionnaires and symptomology rather than on a lab test or something like that. From what I was reading, lab tests are used to identify other kinds of dementias, other kinds of brain disorders, often that can be treated, like, for example, I think a B12 deficiency was one.
Right.
And so if the blood test can identify some specific cause for the brain malfunction that can be addressed, then you've got another category of dementia. When we're remembering, dementia just means brain disorders in general.
Yeah, and I wanted to get to that, though. For diagnosing dementia as opposed to just having a problem with memory or something else, don't they require a person to have at least 2 symptoms? I can't think of what they. I know one of them was memory, obviously, and that seems to be the one that I'm having a challenge with.
Yeah, I kind of noticed that too. But then, they say the older you get, the more likely these issues are to show up. But yeah, they say just on a single symptom, you don't say it's a dementia.
They have to do some more tests.
You have to have a certain number of symptoms depending on.
Yeah, but I was trying to remember the rest of them, or some of the other ones. Do you remember? That's what I was trying to get. And by the way, if you've noticed my memory problems, why didn't you say something?
What memory? What problems? Yeah, right. So.
We don't. If you find it, we can come back to that. But yeah, it just seems like looking at all these different types, they're still just finding their way, really, and. Dementia is just an umbrella name for different brain problems. For instance, we've talked before about Oliver Sacks's book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And for the listeners, this is Oliver Sacks was a neurologist, and he shared 10 case studies that he had with patients with different brain disorders. And the book's title, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, is about a Dr. P, he calls him in here. He doesn't identify anybody by name, but he says that he was a musician, singer, and at the time he came in for treatment or diagnosis, he was a music teacher at a school, but he had noticed that he started acting like Mr. Magoo, and this is Oliver Sacks describing it. The doctor didn't. This patient, but he'd walk down the street and he'd pat fire hydrants on the head, like, because he's thinking they were kids, little children. He suddenly couldn't recognize the faces of his students or even faces of family members and things like that. And I think we hear that a lot about, in symptoms of Alzheimer's. But in any case, this guy had a fine memory. He could still play music, still sing, but he just couldn't. He had an agnosia, which is, I had to look that up, but an agnosia is a loss of the ability to identify objects or people. And what Sachs found was that he could no longer recognize a nose, a mouth, a pair of eyes, and ears, and hair, and beard, or whatever, as a face. But he could notice and describe in detail every individual part. And so, at the time this book was written, which was probably 30 years ago, that wasn't considered a problem. It wasn't considered in any of the categories. It hadn't been seen before, as far as he knew. And but that's not, that's nothing like the symptoms we're talking about here. It just happens to be one part of the brain that's deteriorating. I guess, like you said earlier, the part that assimilates information from different places and produces an image.
Yeah, and there is a particular part of the brain that's specialized function for facial recognition, and so it would seem reasonable to conclude that that part of this individual's brain is what was impacted by whatever the cause may have been, which we don't really know. But that's one of the problems in trying to understand what I've been reading on dementia here is there are different ways of categorizing, and some are broken down by what the symptomology is, and some is broken down by what can be determined about what's going on in the brain, like vascular dementia, which is the second most common. That's associated with strokes. And that can be detected often by brain scan because they can see the effects of stroke in imagery.
Oftentimes only with brain scans, because according to medicinenet.com, vascular dementia is caused by multiple strokes occurring within the brain, but often these strokes may have been unnoticed and the patients may not have any associated symptoms such as weakness, visual loss, or numbness. So, it's subtle things. We could all each be suffering from a stroke every now and then, and just not know it because it's not that severe, but it's going to have an accumulative effect on our brains, I guess.
Right. And then there's categories of dementia. When we talk about dementia broadly this way, that's from brain trauma.
Yeah, and they call that traumatic brain dementia, I think, or brain injury dementia. Let me look at it. I got it here. Traumatic brain injury, yeah, which is what a lot of the soldiers in Iraq suffered from several times over, being sent back into combat repeatedly.
And professional football players.
That too, yes.
Recently.
Oh, yeah, but the NFL said that's not true. Sorry, go ahead.
I won't go into that swamp.
No need to.
But for diagnosis here, this is from the Mayo Clinic's website. According to them, a diagnosis of dementia requires at least 2 core mental functions to be impaired enough to interfere with daily living.
Cool. That's what I was looking for.
They list those core functions as memory, language skills, ability to focus and pay attention, ability to reason and problem solve, and visual perceptions. So those are particular parts of the brain that are responsible for those functions. And so if you're impaired in 2 or more of those functions, then it reaches the threshold
of being called as some kind of dementia.
Being called a dementia.
Yeah. Okay, that satisfies me. That's what I was looking for. I knew it had to have more than one symptom. Okay, then there's also frontal temporal dementia, which that says here on this MedicineNet website, pronounced atrophy or shrinkage of the frontal and temporal lobes in the brain. In addition to forgetfulness and word-finding problems, patients may have marked personality changes, become impulsive, or develop poor judgment. Did you find anything else on that?
So that's a category of dementia that's based on the part of the brain that's affected.
Yeah.
And I saw one report here dividing that into 3 different categories, and here the categories are based on what kind of symptoms they manifest. There's The first type is personality and behavior changes. And the second type is the loss of the meaning of words. And the third type is a problem with producing speech. So there are two categories related to speech, but different.
And I'm guessing those are all
language.
dealt with in the frontal temporal region of the brain? Or?
Yeah, the frontal portion, I believe, deals with the behavior and personality parts, and then the language parts of it's in the temporal.
So yeah, so basically it's just one more symptom or part of the brain that's been identified to be causing dementia. But it just seems to me like it's anything that begins occurring to degenerate your brain's function is going to be eventually called just dementia. You know?
Yeah, well, in that sense, yeah, it's a catch-all phrase.
Yeah.
And memory problems are not a main feature of this frontal temporal dementia. So memory issues show up in other dementias, but
Right.
not in this one.
Yeah, and I read somewhere also where it said that they're not talking about simple forgetfulness, like not being able to remember a face of someone you met, a few days ago or whatever. It's like people suddenly forgetting how to drive back to a home that they've lived in for 30 years, just suddenly not being able to find their way back. And so that's serious stuff there. It's obviously not the forgetfulness that many of us experience.
Yeah, so it's where it impairs your daily living. It's not. I mean, where you forget your keys, that's probably not.
Yeah, that happens to me a lot. I hear a lot of my friends, present company accepted, telling me how they do the same thing I do. They'll walk into a room to get something and then forget why they were going for it. And that happens to me quite a bit, and usually I just forget about it and go back out and do what I was doing, and then it hits me again.
Yeah, well, there was an interesting take on that in this book, The End of Alzheimer's, and apart from the book, there's stages of the progression of dementia where the first is mild cognitive impairment, and that's where you're starting to have some of these things, but they say generally you don't recognize it until you've already progressed beyond it.
Right.
Like it's been going on for 6 months before you realize that that's what you were going through, and now you're in the first stage of Alzheimer's. But in this book, The End of Alzheimer's, about like going into another room and forgetting, it's like, is that part of mild cognitive impairment, or is that earlier than that? And what he's talking about in here is when you get this imbalance with the promotion or destruction of the health of the neurons, as something that's ongoing and incremental. As you lose more and more, it has a cumulative effect. And so maybe mild cognitive impairment, or maybe going into a room and forgetting stuff, that's because you're starting to lose some of these neurons. And what he says in one point in this book is like your brain is in a sense, it's intelligent in the way that it starts to shut itself down when it loses neurons. And it wants to keep going with the more essential parts of your brain, like that control your breathing and your heart rate and stuff like that. And so it starts shutting down your memories that aren't so crucial to the survival of the animal first. That's what goes first.
It probably also, I'm thinking, I don't know though. I mean, I saw neuroplasticity mentioned in some of these places, although as a cure or treatment, it's been debunked that doesn't work. But your brain may start drawing on other parts of the brain to compensate.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that a lot in Oliver Sacks's book. A lot of the people can fake it. They may not remember anything from 2 seconds ago, but they can pretend. They can use other parts of their brain to fabricate an image. And this guy here, the Dr. P, he did the same thing. He would hypothesize about what he was looking at and come up with a really detailed, vivid description of it. And he totally wrong, but that's what he was compensating for it.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing dementia, the different aspects of it, and then, the different aspects we've been able to learn and understand anyway. Feel free to call in with your thoughts, questions, challenges, 343-9927, 343-9927.
And so you mentioned about neuroplasticity, and that that has been discussed as one way to address this, and then it's shown not to be effective. And I think that's working from the perspective that there's like a single or a primary or a few essential components that are responsible for the condition, and that if you can just fix this one or two things, then you're going to reverse the course, which is also the mindset of looking for a silver bullet pill that's going to cure this.
Right, and that actually I thought of this as a suggestion for a friend of mine who was diagnosed with a degenerative brain disorder years ago. I was just finishing up a book on neuroplasticity, and the way I thought of it was, okay, if the way neuroplasticity works is that if a part of if one brain function goes away, say if somebody loses their sight, at 30 years old or whatever, and we were always told as when we were kids, it's people who go blind, who aren't born blind but go blind, suddenly develop extra sensitive touch and smell and other senses, and that's because all the different parts of the brain, as I understand it, are competing for a limited number of neurotransmitters. And if a part of the brain stops functioning, its neurotransmitters... Neurons, okay, thank you. I was called on that once before, and I was trying to get it right this time instead. But anyhow, if a part of the brain, like, say, we're dealing with sight, stops because of an injury or whatever...
No longer getting input from...
Right, it's no longer getting input, so those neurons associated with that part of the brain are no longer used, and eventually the other parts of the brain will see these neurons, and they're always looking for new neurons to strengthen themselves, kind of like the survival of the fittest, but they'll grab up those extra neurons, and that's why the other senses become more enhanced. And I was thinking that if this friend of mine was losing a part of his brain function, he might be able to do exercises to strengthen what was left, to compensate, like this guy here, Dr. P, was doing. But apparently that's not going to work.
Well, I don't know, but describing the first situation like losing sight, you haven't lost the brain function, you've lost the sensory input to it, so you still got healthy neurons in there that are being redeployed for other purposes.
Right, that's what I was
Whereas
getting
if you've got neurons dying off,
yes,
then you're losing your total capacity, your total neuron power. But that doesn't mean that some of the brain training work might help if it's done in conjunction with addressing the other factors that are contributing to the death of the neurons and trying to turn around that. And then the neurogeneration could be a factor to replace the ones that have been destroyed if you stop the destruction and you've reversed the balance that's described in this book, The End of Alzheimer's, between the destruction of neurons and the growth of neurons.
Right, and they're both are going on all the time, according to the book. What was the author's name again?
Dale Bredesen, Dr. Dale E. Bredesen.
Okay, Dale Bredesen.
B-R-E-D-S-E-N.
The End of Alzheimer's, yeah, okay. And I just lost my thought. Uh-oh.
Well, that's apropos of the topic, I guess.
Yeah, well, come on now. Let's not focus on it. Tell me what I was going to ask you. We were talking about what?
So I'm to be psychic as well.
Yeah, well.
So what he's describing are these 36 holes in the roof.
Right, but what I was going to say was the destruction of neurons, which is the first time I think you said that this evening, including before the show. Or at least it's the first time I've heard it from you. But the destruction and the generation of neurons goes on all the time, even in healthy people, right?
That's what some sources have said.
Okay.
There's some that are questioning that, and some are saying, well, certain parts of the brain can generate neurons and other parts don't. But there's also we talked about brain training, but then there's physical activity that is beneficial for neurogenesis, they say, creating new neurons. And that's one of the treatments that is promoted, although that alone's not going to not going to solve the problem if you still have the imbalances that are destroying the neurons.
Right, but it's the imbalance, and you were saying earlier that's what osteoporosis is. The bones.
Well, he drew an analogy to
Yeah, or you did,
osteoporosis
okay.
where you've got a balance between destruction in laying down new bone, and when that gets out of balance where it's being torn down faster than it's being built up, then you end up with osteoporosis. And he analogized that here you've got with Alzheimer's a situation where the neurons are being destroyed faster than they're being replenished. And,
Right.
and specifically with these particular neurotransmitter receptors on the neurons, that they're either attached to a transmitter or a protein that's beneficial for the health of the cell, or if that's destructive of it, and it's the amyloid beta that builds these plaques. That's one of the things that if it attaches to this receptor, it causes the cell to destroy the synapse and then ultimately destroy the cell. And part of what's released when it attaches is more amyloid beta. So
Right.
it becomes like a cycle, a prion cycle is what he refers to it.
And one of the things that I found, to my surprise, I mean, I don't think they have a cure for any of these problems. They have ways to control the symptoms, and on some of them, they say the best way to control it is to control the factors that cause it. For instance, I think it was vascular dementia is caused by uncontrolled hypertension, and
That's basically what causes strokes,
Right,
which
yes.
are often the same kinds of things that are involved in heart disease.
Yeah, so they basically say that, catch these symptoms early, catch these things like hypertension and other things, and catch them early and get them under control.
So
The sleep disorders can also bring on dementia, right?
well, it can be a contributing factor.
Right.
Apnea. I mean, the Mayo Clinic's website on dementia listed risk factors that cannot be changed and risk factors that you can change, and sleep apnea is one of those that you can change, and heavy alcohol use, and cardiovascular risk factors that you were just referring to.
Mm-hmm.
And depression, diabetes, and smoking are the other risk factors under a person's control. But then if you look at this, Dr. Bredeson's approach, he's identified 36 factors that are involved in specifically the issues with this receptor on the neurons, in that description of the dynamics of the disease.
Okay, yeah, and I'm looking here at an article titled Neurobiological Effects of Physical Exercise, and this claims that aerobic exercise of about 30 minutes per day induces persistent improvements in certain cognitive functions, healthy alterations in gene expression in the brain, and beneficial forms of neuroplasticity and behavioral plasticity. So this, along with lots of other treatments, can have an impact, a positive impact on brain health.
Yeah, and additional benefits from these studies is long-term effects that include increased neuron growth, which would be replacing the dead neurons,
Yep.
and increased neurological activity, and enhanced cognitive control of behavior, which is one of the factors in some forms of dementia is inappropriate behavior, and improved working memory, which is present in quite a few of the dementias, is memory problems.
Yeah, and then they say in this article also, and like you were just saying, reviews of clinical evidence also support the use of exercise as an adjunct therapy for certain neurodegenerative disorders, particularly Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So basically living a healthy life and getting exercise can help you avoid these things,
Yeah, in Dr. Bredesen identifies three broad categories, which he associates with three different forms of Alzheimer's, and one of them are factors related to inflammation and the health impacts from that, which are in large part dietary, and then the factors of deficiencies in the factors that are essential for a healthy functioning of the neurons, and then the third category are toxins, which things in our environment that we encounter that many of them never existed before.
Yeah, in our processed foods and everything, preservatives and whatnot.
In industrial pollution.
Yeah, and that too. That's we probably have all kinds of stuff in our bodies that's promoting a lot of these things, and we just absorb it every day. I wanted to talk a little bit about the myths of Alzheimer's that I found from the Alzheimer's Association. And something I was told years ago was the accumulation of aluminum in the body can cause it. And they say here that during the 60s and 70s, aluminum emerged as a possible suspect in Alzheimer's, and it led to concern about the use of aluminum pots and pans, be it beverage cans, antacids, and antiperspirants, because they have aluminum in them also. And they say that there's really no evidence. It's been largely confirmed that that is not a factor as far as they know.
Yeah, well, again, if the paradigm for study is looking for a single cause and a single effect, then, and if in fact there are multiple pathways, then trying to find one cure or one cause is not going to be successful. And so that doesn't mean that aluminum isn't one of the factors that, in conjunction with other inputs, would have this effect.
They can't just eliminate it, because they can't eliminate one of them and just say, oh, this isn't it.
Well, I don't know that it would depend on the kind of study you do,
and
what
here
level,
again,
whether you're looking down at the microscopic cellular level, or whether
right.
you're looking at just what's in the diet.
Okay, well, we didn't get to cover all the different types of dementia, but I hopefully we got some interesting information out there. That book is The End of Alzheimer's by Dr.
Bredesen, Dr. Dale Bredesen, Bredesen. He's a professor at UCLA.
All right, well, we got to go, Lang, and I thank you for your generous provision of your intellect today. And
it's just what I've been researching the last few days. It's fascinating.
No. Let me flatter you. Anyway, y'all been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We've been talking about dementia. Next week, I'll have a couple of local high school students on to talk about the recent walkout over gun violence. Anyway, we got to go. You have a good night.